My name is Antonia Walker, born on the 2nd day of November in the year 1948, in a wooden shack tucked deep into the mountains of eastern Kentucky. I learned to be silent long before I learned to speak. In my house, words were like fine china. They only broke during moments of anger, and when they broke, they cut deep. I was the third of 5 children, but I knew early on that I didn't hold the same worth as my brothers. My mother, Margaret, was a woman with a hard stare, the kind that never truly touched you, even when it seemed to look right through you. My father, well, I believed he was Mr. Charles Walker, the man who lived with us but never looked at me twice. Later, I would learn that he was never my father at all. The house I grew up in was made of old wooden planks, with cracks that let the wind sing through the walls in winter. We had no electricity, no running water, but what I missed most wasn't comfort, it was affection. There was a staleness in the air, a smell of contempt that lingered especially around me. My mother lived for her boys, her little kings, as she called them. For me and my younger sister, we were the invisible servants. We woke before sunrise. At just 6 years old, I already knew how to light the wood-burning stove. Even with fingers frozen from the morning frost, I washed clothes down by the creek, scrubbing each garment like my worth depended on it. And in a way, it did. If a sheet came out dirty, I was beaten. If I was too slow, I was beaten. If I didn't cry, I was beaten harder. Silence was my only shield. But inside me, there was something no punishment could kill. A burning desire to learn. I wasn't allowed to go to school. That was a privilege reserved for the boys, but I would listen from the shadows as my brothers spoke of lessons, books, maps. At night, when the house was quiet, I waited for my oldest brother, James, who would sometimes drop an old notebook into my lap by accident. It was our secret. He whispered lessons to me softly, as if every word were a crime. One night, while thumbing through a worn book, I found a photograph hidden between the pages. It was an old, yellowed portrait of a young man with bright eyes and a sad smile. On the back, written in fading ink, it said, "To Margaret with eternal love, Anthony." My heart raced. That name had never been spoken in our house. For days I couldn't stop thinking about it. Finally, in a moment of rare courage, I asked my mother who Anthony was. She went pale, then hardened. "He wasn't a real man," she said coldly, and ordered me to scrub the floor until it shone. In that moment, I understood. There was something buried deep in those walls, something sharp and unfinished. Over time, I pieced together the truth. Anthony Mitchell was my real father, a young man from a nearby town who loved my mother, but had been forced to marry the daughter of a powerful politician, torn from her life like a weed from the garden. And the bitterness of that loss had been poured directly onto me. Her fury wasn't just about me. It was about him, too. I grew up carrying that weight, but also a secret plan to escape. I didn't know when or how, but I knew I wouldn't die in that house. I refused to believe that my destiny was to serve, obey, and disappear. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice insisted that I was meant for more. A voice that no slap or scream could silence. At 17, my mother sealed my fate with a bargain I had no say in. Peter Sullivan, a town merchant, a widower known more for drinking than for selling, had made a deal with her. In exchange for vague promises and a bottle of fine whiskey, he would have my hand in marriage. Or rather, my body, my future, my voice. Margaret told me the wedding would be in the spring. She said it like someone warning about an incoming storm. That night, I cried in silence like I had so many times before. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer the little girl by the creek. I was a woman. And that woman knew she would die from the inside out if she stayed. My only friend was Karen Thompson, the daughter of the local seamstress. A girl with bright eyes and a brave heart. I told her everything. She didn't hesitate. She gave me a sack of bread, a few coins, and a hand-drawn map. Hidden at the bottom of my bag were the few dollars I had saved secretly by sewing buttons and hems for neighbors penny by penny for 2 long years. It was my ticket out. In the early hours of April 15th, while everyone slept, I slipped out the back door. The ground was wet with dew, and the sky filled with stars that had never seemed to shine for me. With my heart in my throat and my father's name echoing in my mind, I stepped into the unknown. Louisville was the city that promised everything or nothing. I didn't know what waited for me there. I just knew I could never go back. I arrived in Louisville with nothing but a bag of clothes, a few dollars, and a name I'd held onto like a prayer. Linda. Aunt Linda was my mother's younger sister, the kind of woman who had once dared to leave home before she was old enough to vote and never looked back. I had only met her once, when I was about 4 years old, but I remembered the way her laugh had filled a room like warm light. When I knocked on her door, dirty, exhausted, shaking with fear, I half expected her not to recognize me, or worse, to slam the door shut. But she opened it with wide eyes and soft arms, and without a single question, she pulled me into her chest and whispered, "You're safe now." That was the first time I cried in someone's arms. Linda's home was small but warm, with shelves full of books, framed photographs, and the scent of cinnamon and coffee in the air. She lived alone, worked as a librarian, and spent her evenings knitting or reading. For the first time in my life, I slept in a bed that smelled like lavender and didn't creak with every breath. I woke up to the sound of birds, not a mother's demands. She didn't ask much in the beginning. She let me settle, let me breathe. And then, gently, she started asking questions. I told her the truth, not all at once. Not everything, but enough for her to understand the bruises I wasn't wearing anymore. Within 2 weeks, she had enrolled me in night classes at a local community center. I could barely believe it. Real books, real teachers, a desk with my name on it. I clutched my notebooks like they were gold. I soaked up every word, every formula, every poem. Knowledge, for me, wasn't just power, it was oxygen. I also needed a job. Linda had enough to feed me, but I wanted more than survival. I wanted purpose. She helped me find a part-time job at a dress shop on Main Street. It was called Lillian's Closet, and from the first moment I stepped into that store, surrounded by bolts of fabric, threads, and mannequins draped in lace and satin, I felt something click. The owner, Lillian Price, was a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense woman in her 60s, who had started the business with a borrowed sewing machine and a stubborn dream. She didn't care where I came from. She only cared that I had a good eye and steady hands, and I did. Years of mending pants, sewing patches, and fixing buttons in the dark had taught me more than I realized. Under her guidance, I flourished. Within months, I was sketching dresses, adjusting patterns, pinning designs to models. I had found a language I didn't know I spoke. Fashion, it was in that little shop, among spools of thread and whispers of chiffon, that I met David. He came in looking for a gift for his mother's birthday. Tall, soft-spoken, with glasses that always slid down his nose and a quiet curiosity about everything. We talked about books. We talked about art. He didn't ask about my past. He asked about my dreams. I hadn't realized until then that I had. Then we started meeting for coffee, then long walks, then dinners, and one winter evening. After 2 years of friendship and gentle romance, he asked if I'd ever thought of marrying someone kind. I laughed. I never thought I'd be allowed to choose, I said. And he replied, then choose me. And I did. Our wedding was small, simple. Linda cried through the whole thing. Lillian made my dress ivory silk with hand-stitched roses. At the hem, we moved into a modest apartment with cracked tiles and a leaky faucet. But to me, it felt like a castle. I had love. I had safety. I had freedom. And every day, I reminded myself that none of it came easy. But the past has a way of knocking even when the doors are locked. In the spring of 1969, a letter arrived. My mother had died. The house, the land, everything she had left was now legally mine. I stared at the envelope for hours. A house that had once felt like a prison now belonged to me. I thought about selling it. I thought about burning it. But then, I thought about something else entirely. I thought about how many girls were still living in homes like that, still waking up at 4 in the morning, still scrubbing floors while boys went to school, still being told they were worth nothing. That night, I told David I had an idea. A wild, impossible, beautiful idea. I want to turn that house into something that saves instead of destroys, I said. A place where girls can learn, where they can sew, read, dream, a place for the ones like me. He didn't blink. He just took my hand and said, then let's build it. The return to that house in the Kentucky mountains felt like stepping into the pages of a nightmare I thought I'd long since closed. David insisted on driving me. I hadn't been back since the night I fled at 17, and now, standing on the porch once again, key in hand, the memories clawed their way out of the cracks in the wood. The boards still creaked the same way under my feet. The front door still stuck on the lower hinge. The windows were clouded with dust, and the smell earthy, cold, laced with mildew, and memory hit me like a slap. My hands trembled as I walked through each room, ghosts whispering from corners. I saw my younger self kneeling on the floor, scrubbing. I saw Margaret's silhouette by the stove, back turned, face hard. I heard the silence. I felt the weight. David stayed quiet. He knew I needed the silence, this time, to be mine. We spent weeks cleaning the place out, room by room, memory by memory. We tore down moldy curtains, pulled up warped floorboards, scrubbed until our knuckles bled. And beneath all that decay, something began to emerge, a skeleton of possibility, a place that could become new. I didn't have much money, but what I had, I poured into that house. David helped with every spare dollar. Aunt Linda donated books and sewing machines. Lillian sent me bolts of fabric she could no longer use. And in the spring of 1970, the doors of the Anthony Mitchell Center for Arts and Skills opened for the first time. I named it after the man I never met, the one who loved my mother and paid for it with silence. I wanted his name to mean something. I wanted that name to rescue someone, even if it never rescued me in those early days. I taught everything myself. I offered free sewing classes on weekday mornings, cooking and budgeting in the afternoons, reading and writing in the evenings. My first students were shy, broken girls, some no older than I had been when I ran, some bruised in places you couldn't see, some mothers already, some just children with the weight of women on their shoulders. I knew their silences. I knew the way they flinched when praised, as if kindness were a trick. So I spoke gently. I never raised my voice. I kept the doors open and the lights warm. I made sure every girl had her name embroidered on a cloth, something of her own. Stitched in thread and hope, word spread slowly. Neighbors whispered, curious. A few came to see what the strange girl from the Walker house was doing. Some mocked, some warned others to stay away. But I didn't care. I was no longer trying to please anyone. I was building something. By the mid-70s, we had added more classes: basic accounting, small business planning, legal literacy. Karen, my childhood friend who helped me escape, moved to Louisville to join me. She had trained as a nurse and offered health workshops. She also brought laughter, the kind that made even the oldest wounds feel less permanent. We held fundraisers, sewing auctions, bake sales, donation drives. Slowly, painfully, the center began to grow. I hired teachers. Volunteers came in from local colleges. The front room became a classroom. The kitchen became a workshop. The attic became a dormitory for girls with nowhere to sleep. One night, after a particularly long day, I stood outside watching the windows glow with lamplight and laughter. For the first time in my life, that house looked beautiful. Not because it was fixed, but because it was full of people who believed in something better. In 1977, David and I welcomed our first child, Emily. Her birth felt like the softest miracle. Holding her, I wept for every girl who never got to feel safe. I whispered promises to her as she slept on my chest that she would never question her worth, never be silenced, never be owned. 3 years later, we had Christopher. Strong, thoughtful, always curious, even as toddlers. They grew up among threads and books and women with stories heavier than stone. They learned early to listen, to help, to treat every person who walked through our doors with dignity, no matter what they carried with them. By the early 1980s, the center was serving over 100 women a year. We had waiting lists, letters from nearby towns, even some churches asking for support in starting their own workshops. I began traveling first, across Kentucky, then to other southern states, teaching others how to build centers like ours. We created toolkits, wrote guides, offered mentorship. David, ever the quiet engine behind my dreams, handled the finances. He kept our books immaculate, found donors, balanced every risk. He believed in me more than I did. Sometimes, he once told me, "You may have started this with thread and pain, but now you're weaving a future." And he was right. But there was more to come, and more to face. My past wasn't done with me yet. In the spring of 1986, I found a lumpy. It was small, barely noticeable, sitting just beneath the skin of my left breast like a secret I hadn't agreed to keep. I told myself it was nothing. I had too much work to do, too many women depending on me, too many projects underway, and 2 children who still needed help with homework and scraped knees. But deep down, I knew. I remembered the stories. I remembered the whispers of illness that had followed my mother in her final years, the way she'd grown weaker, thinner, quieter. No one had told me the cause. No one had thought I deserved to know. But I had seen the fear in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. This time, I was watching closely. I went to the clinic alone, not wanting to worry David or the children. I sat in a cold waiting room with walls painted a color meant to calm and magazines no one ever read. The tests were quick, clinical, and final. Breast cancer, stage 2. The doctor was kind. His voice was soft, but the words fell hard. I didn't cry in his office. I didn't cry on the way home. But that night, After the children were asleep and David gently asked, "How did it go?" I crumbled. "I can't fall apart," I whispered, clinging to him. "Too many people need me." He held me tighter and said, "Then we fight, not just for them but for you." Treatment was grueling. The surgery came first, followed by endless rounds of chemotherapy. My body, once strong from years of work and motion, became a battlefield. My hair fell out. My appetite vanished. I was exhausted in ways I didn't know a human could be. But I kept teaching, kept showing up at the center, even when I could barely walk from the parking lot to the door. The women there, my women, they noticed. They brought soup. They cleaned the floors. They read to me when my eyes could no longer focus. And when I finally had to step back for a few weeks, they ran the center without me. It was then that I realized something profound. The mission had grown beyond me. It no longer depended solely on my hands or voice. It lived in every stitch sewn by a girl who once believed she had no future. In every woman who learned to budget, write her own name, or walk away from a man who used his fists instead of words. We had built something real, something unbreakable. By the time I entered remission in 1988, the center had already trained over 5,000 women. Our first cohort of graduates had started their own shops, one in Knoxville, another in Nashville. One even opened a mobile sewing studio inside a converted bus, traveling to rural towns to teach girls too far from cities to reach our walls. That same year, we launched our first microcredit program, small, interest-free loans for women who wanted to start businesses. It began with just 7 applicants. All of them repaid the loans in full. One of them, a single mother named Joanna Pierce, turned her loan into a homegrown curtain business that later supplied major hotels throughout the state. Emily and Christopher were teenagers by then, their lives deeply rooted in the soil I had once fled. They understood where we came from, but they also saw where we were going. Emily had inherited my eye for detail. She designed and stitched with a grace I never could. Christopher, with David's quiet intelligence, was already reading financial reports by 15. One day, I sat at the edge of the porch, the same porch where I had once stood terrified to re-enter my own past, and watched Emily measure fabric under the soft ember of sunset light. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" I asked her. She smiled. "Only when I realize how many people still need this place." That's when I knew the mission would outlive me. My children would carry it forward, not as a burden, but as a calling. In 1993, we bought the neighboring land and built our first official extension, a second building with a proper classroom, a kitchen for culinary skills, and a daycare for mothers who otherwise couldn't attend. It filled within 2 months. That same year, we received our first visit from a federal representative. They wanted to learn how a program that started in a broken-down shack in rural Kentucky had managed to lift thousands of women out of poverty without any government funding. I told them the truth. We didn't start with money. We started with pain, and then we stitched it into purpose. I didn't know then that the Department of Education would become one of our biggest partners in the years to come, or that Emily would one day take our designs overseas, or that Christopher would create a sustainable funding model that would attract international foundations. All I knew was that I had survived, that this house once filled with shadows was now filled with possibility, and that, for the first time, I was ready to forgive. Not forget, but forgive. Even Margaret. I never expected forgiveness to come quietly. For most of my life, my mother's face lived behind my eyes like a shadow that never left the room. I tried to bury her with distance, with success, with the warmth I built for others, but she lingered. In my tone, in my fears, in the way I sometimes hesitated to accept kindness, as if it were something I hadn't earned. It wasn't until I stood alone in front of her grave, some 10 years after her death, that I finally allowed the silence between us to settle. The stone was plain. No flowers. No one had visited in months, maybe years. I ran my fingers across the engraving. Margaret Louise Walker, 1923 to 1969, and whispered the words I never got to say when she was alive. I understand you were broken, but I won't let your wounds become mine. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, letting the air take whatever bitterness I had left. And when I turned away, I felt lighter. By the late 1990s, the Anthony Mitchell Center had become something I could barely recognize. No longer a converted cabin, but a multi-building campus, humming with purpose. We added a legal aid office, mental health counselors, and even a publishing workshop where women could write and share their stories. Some of those stories would later appear in national magazines. One was turned into a short documentary. Another became required reading in community colleges throughout the South. I remember holding one of those first published journals in my hands, feeling the pages like skin, knowing that these women, once silenced like I had been, were now permanent voices in the world. But joy has a habit of arriving alongside sorrow. In the summer of 2001, David began to slow down. It wasn't just age, it was something deeper. He was forgetting things, misplacing numbers, repeating conversations. At first, we laughed it off. We said things like, "You're just tired," or "You've got too many spreadsheets in your head." But I knew better. The diagnosis came in early 2002, early onset Alzheimer's. My heart cracked open. This man, who had carried me through every storm, now needed me to carry him. He forgot my birthday, then our anniversary. One day, he forgot where he was while driving home from the center. And eventually, he forgot the name of the house we had built together, the house that had saved both of us. And I stepped back from expansion projects. I left most of the traveling to Christopher, who was now managing the organization's operations full-time. Emily had started her own fashion line, Threaded Light, a collection inspired by the designs we had once stitched by hand in the old sewing room. Her first show in Paris had earned standing ovations, but she came home immediately after. She always came home. We took care of David as a family, not out of obligation but out of deep, endless love. I read to him every night. We walked the gardens together. Sometimes, he would smile suddenly and say, "I remember this place. I think I built it with someone I loved." And I would answer, "Yes, you did." He passed peacefully in the winter of 2010. Emily was holding one hand. I held the other. The center closed for a week in mourning, not because I asked for it, but because every woman there knew that he was as much a founder as I was. His funeral brought hundreds. Former students, teachers, volunteers, even the mayor. Christopher spoke first, then Emily. Then I stood in front of the crowd, looked out at faces I had seen grow from fear into fire, and I said, David Walker believed in building things that lasted. Not just structures but people, families, futures. He believed that love is a kind of education, and I am who I am because of what he taught me. We planted a dogwood tree in the front garden of the center, just beneath the old kitchen window, where we had once prepared soup for a dozen hungry girls. A brass plaque reads, "In memory of David Walker, builder of hope." In the years that followed, I threw myself into the work more fiercely than ever, not out of grief, but out of resolve. I traveled again: New York, Chicago, New Orleans, meeting with education departments, women's groups, international NGOs. Our model became a blueprint for similar centers around the world: India, Brazil, South Africa. In 2015, something extraordinary happened. The United States Department of Education formally recognized the Anthony Mitchell Center as a federal institute for women's vocational advancement. It was the first of its kind in the country. Grants came in, construction crews arrived, and over the course of 12 months, the once tiny home of my childhood was transformed into a fully equipped institute, complete with laboratories, dormitories, art studios, and a massive library. I walked through the grand opening ceremony with Emily on one side and Christopher on the other. Both of them had taken my dream and expanded it in ways I could have never imagined. A reporter asked me that day, "Mrs. Walker, what do you hope young girls will feel when they walk into this building?" I looked up at the sky, then down at the hands I had once used to scrub cold floors, and said, "I hope they feel like they belong to themselves." I never thought I'd see a day when women would travel across the country just to walk through the doors of the house that once tried to swallow me whole. But that's exactly what happened. By 2016, buses arrived weekly, filled with girls from the Bronx, from Oakland, from reservation towns in Arizona, and farming communities in Kansas. Some came alone. Some came holding tight to the hands of younger sisters, mothers, even grandmothers. Many had never seen the inside of a plane before. Many had never heard their own names spoken with respect. And now they came here for education. Yes, for skills, certainly. But more than anything, they came for something even more sacred. They came to believe in themselves. The old kitchen was now a culinary lab with industrial ovens and countertops that gleamed. The sewing room, where I once taught girls to thread a needle by candlelight, had become a design studio filled with digital machines, adjustable mannequins, and mood boards covered in sketches of future runway shows. Emily, who had once stitched beside me as a little girl, now stood at the helm of her own international fashion brand. But she still came home every month. She hosted seminars, mentored students, and insisted that every design line from threaded light include at least one garment made in collaboration with a woman from the center. "You can't walk forward without remembering the road," she told them, "and our road is stitched right into these seams." Christopher had become the financial architect behind our expansion. Calm and methodical like his father, he traveled to foundations and universities, building bridges, securing funding, and quietly reminding the world that what we were doing wasn't charity. It was infrastructure. It was justice. By this point, I was in my late 60s, though age never slowed me much. I had lines around my eyes and silver streaks in my hair, but my spine was straight, and my will was stronger than ever. I no longer taught every day, but I still sat in on classes, still met every new student personally, still walked the halls every morning with a notebook in hand, checking for lights left on, doors left open, or spirits left unnoticed. One afternoon, as I stood outside watching a group of young women plant flowers in the front garden, where David's tree had grown tall and proud, I heard someone call out, "Mrs. Walker." I turned. A woman stood there, maybe in her 40s, holding the hand of a girl no older than 10. Her face was familiar in the way memories are, blurry at first, then suddenly sharp. "Joanna?" I asked. She nodded, tears already falling. "You gave me my first loan 30 years ago, for curtains. I laughed. I remember. You stitched every hem like it was meant for a palace. She knelt beside her daughter. This is Rachel. She wants to be a writer. Rachel looked up at me with eyes full of light, and I realized, in that moment, that I was no longer just teaching women how to sew, or count, or read. I was helping build generations. We began offering mother-daughter retreats, then grandmother-daughter workshops. We created programs for boys, too, because I never wanted another young man to grow up thinking silence or dominance made him strong. We taught empathy, accountability, love. That same year, I was invited to speak at the National Women's Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. I had never spoken to more than 300 people before. This would be nearly 3,000. The night before, I sat in my hotel room, trying to prepare. My hands trembled like they hadn't in decades. And then I remembered a girl barefoot, hands red from creek water, heart full of questions no one ever answered, standing in the woods with a bag of bread and a name in her pocket. She had survived. She had built something that lasted. She had become me. At the summit, I walked onto the stage slowly. The crowd quieted. The lights were blinding, but I wasn't afraid. I told them everything, not the polished version, but the truth. About Margaret, about the photo of Anthony, about Peter Sullivan and the deal made without my voice, about the wood stove, the hunger, the silence, about how I had turned it all into fire, into action, into hope. I ended with these words: the sweetest kind of revenge is not watching others suffer as you once did. The sweetest kind of revenge is using your pain to ensure no one else has to. One day, the dark basement becomes a room full of light. The applause didn't stop for a long time. In the months that followed, we received letters from all over the country, from prisons, from shelters, from girls who had read my words and seen, for the first time, a reflection of themselves in someone who made it out. But I didn't just want to inspire. I wanted to provide tools. So we launched an online platform, Threads of Change, giving women around the world access to our programs, video tutorials, microloan applications, legal guides, mental health resources, all free, all in 10 languages, accessible even from a phone in the middle of nowhere. We reached 50,000 women in under 2 years. At 70, I was invited to the White House to receive the Presidential Medal of Citizen Leadership. Emily flew in from Milan. Christopher canceled a major pitch in San Francisco. And Linda, my brave aunt who opened her door to a trembling girl so many years ago, held my hand the entire evening in my acceptance speech. I looked directly at the president, then out at the crowd, and said, "This medal belongs to every woman who chose to rise instead of remain." I was not saved. I was not rescued. I ran, and then I reached back, so others could run too. By the time I turned 75, people began using a word I had always been too afraid to say aloud: legacy. At first, I resisted it. Legacy sounded too final, too carved in stone. To me, it felt like something you leave after you've stopped living. But I was still here, waking up before dawn, walking the halls of the Institute with my clipboard, answering letters from girls in faraway towns, helping new students find their way to their first sewing class or English lesson. I wasn't done, not yet. But still, something had shifted. I noticed it one afternoon when I stood at the back of the auditorium during orientation. It was the start of the fall term, and the room was packed over 100 women from 14 states. The energy in that space pulsed with promise. On stage was one of our former graduates, Monica Ruiz, now a civil rights attorney. She was telling her story how she escaped a forced marriage at 16, arrived at the institute with nothing but a plastic bag of clothes, and left 5 years later with a scholarship to Columbia University. And the most beautiful part, almost no one looked at me. They looked at her. That's when I knew. The movement no longer wore my name. It wore theirs. It was a strange but liberating feeling. I had spent most of my life creating space for others to shine. Now, I was watching a wildfire I had started with a single match spread farther than I ever imagined. In early 2020, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Anthony Mitchell Center. It was a weekend full of reunions, speeches, laughter, and memories. Women flew in from all over the world. Some arrived with children, some with grandchildren. A few came in wheelchairs. All came with stories. There was Marie, who now runs a textile business in Uganda that employs over 200 women. There was Devin, a former foster child who became a social worker and founded a shelter for LGBTQ youth in North Carolina. And then there was Grace, a girl I had taught to sew at 13 after she arrived pregnant and afraid. Now, at 38, she stood with her teenage daughter, both dressed in gowns they had designed together, both preparing to walk the runway. In our alumni fashion show, as I sat watching from the front row, Emily leaned over and whispered, "You made this possible, Mom." But I shook my head gently. No, I just opened the door. They walked through it. That night, Christopher surprised me with something I hadn't expected. After the final speech, he stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and asked me to join him. I hesitated, but the crowd was already on its feet. 50 years ago, he said, my mother came back to the place that broke her. Not to destroy it, but to rebuild it into something the world had never seen. She gave up her comfort, her health, her safety, to build safety for others. And now, we honor her the only way we know how. Behind him, a screen lit up with blueprints, a brand new building, sleek, modern, designed by women architects trained through our programs. It would house advanced design labs, coding and engineering classrooms, a green tech workshop, and an international women's innovation library. The name? The Antonia Walker Center for Courage and Craft. I covered my mouth with both hands. I don't remember what I said that night. Maybe I didn't say anything. Maybe some moments are too big for words. But I remember the warmth of Emily's hand in mine. I remember the tears on Christopher's face. I remember thinking that, maybe, legacy wasn't an ending after all, that it was a relay. The following year, the world changed. The pandemic came swiftly, stealing breath, safety, normalcy. Our doors had to close. For a few terrifying weeks, I feared everything we had built might fall. But our staff adapted. Our students adapted. Classes went virtual. Machines were delivered to homes. Wi-Fi hotspots were installed in community vans. And our women began sewing thousands of cloth masks for hospitals and shelters. We launched a rapid response program, food deliveries, emergency childcare support, even mental health check-ins. Christopher organized a relief fund. Emily pivoted her fashion brand to produce reusable medical gowns. And in the darkest year many of us had ever known, I saw something beautiful. Our center didn't just survive, it led. We emerged stronger, more united. And when we reopened, our enrollment tripled in 2022. I began writing my memoir, not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I wanted to leave a trail. A map, something for the girls who might one day stand barefoot by a creek, wondering if escape was even possible. The title came to me easily, A Room Full of Light. I wrote late at night, usually with a mug of tea beside me, and the quiet creaks of the old house settling into its bones. Sometimes I'd pause at a memory, a sound, a smell, a face, and feel the old pain stir. But I never let it stay long. I had long since learned how to stitch pain into something useful. The book was published in 2023. To my surprise, it became a national bestseller. Book clubs read it, classrooms studied it, journalists quoted it. But the most meaningful responses were the handwritten letters. I received hundreds of them from women who said, "You told my story before I even knew how to tell it." And that, more than any award or plaque or medal, reminded me why I had started all of this in the first place. Because one girl believed she didn't deserve silence, and she ran. By the age of 77, I had learned how to sit still, not because I had grown tired, but because I had finally made peace with watching others lead. I had become the soil. For decades, I had been the seed, the root, the hand that dug into the earth and made something grow. But now, I found myself walking the campus and marveling at what had bloomed. I didn't need to be in every room anymore. I didn't need to carry every answer. The place ran on its own rhythm, led by women who once arrived shaking and left standing tall. I still had my office tucked inside the original house, though it looked nothing like the one I had first escaped. The wood walls had been preserved, restored with care, but the space was now lined with photographs. The first class of graduates in 1972, the microloan group from 1985, the team that responded during the pandemic. David's picture was there too, placed gently above the bookshelf, watching over us all. One morning, I was sipping coffee at my desk when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," I said, not looking up. A young woman entered, tall, with tightly braided hair, holding a folder to her chest. She looked nervous, the way I used to look whenever I had to ask for something that mattered too much. "Mrs. Walker," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "May I speak with you?" Her name was Tessa, 22 years old, originally from rural Alabama, a former foster child, a survivor of domestic abuse, and the recipient of one of our national scholarships. She had just completed the center's advanced entrepreneurship program. She sat down across from me and opened her folder, revealing sketches, budget plans, and a written proposal. Her dream: to open a home textiles business that trained other young women aging out of foster care. She wanted to call it Second Thread. I listened. I asked questions, and then I closed the folder. "You don't need my permission," I told her, "but you have my blessing and my support." She blinked, surprised. "Just like that?" I smiled. "You've already done the hardest part. You've believed in yourself." She started crying, the kind of tears that rise not from weakness, but from deep, overwhelming release. I walked her to the door, hugged her, and as she left, I sat back and realized something. The torch wasn't being passed, it had already been caught. That same year, we held our first Global Threads Summit, bringing together women from our sister centers across the world. Representatives came from over 30 countries, each with their own stories, struggles, and victories. Some brought garments made by their students. Others brought food, music, letters written in languages I didn't speak but still understood. We shared our ideas, our failures, our roots. I stood before them on the final day, looking at the sea of faces, all of them fierce, all of them builders of something bigger than themselves, and I said, We are not isolated stitches. We are a tapestry. That phrase stuck. It became our new motto. We had it printed on banners, etched into workshop walls, embroidered into welcome kits. Not isolated stitches. A tapestry, and when I walked through the halls, I saw the proof of that every day. There was an alumna from Georgia teaching digital design in our tech lab, a former refugee from Syria running our embroidery class, a grandmother from Michigan who had lost everything to addiction but now ran our on-site childcare center with joy in her eyes and crayons in her pockets. Each one of them carried a thread. Each one wove it into the next. In the fall of 2024, Emily's company, Threaded Light, was chosen to represent the United States at the World Sustainable Fashion Expo in Milan. She insisted on bringing 5 of our top students with her to showcase their collaborative designs. The youngest was 19, the oldest, a 46-year-old seamstress who had escaped trafficking and rebuilt her life one hemline at a time. They returned beaming, and with them, they brought global attention that would change everything. Within 6 months, we were flooded with partnership offers. Universities wanted to study our model. Corporations offered to fund satellite campuses. International nonprofits requested training packages. And through it all, I kept asking the same question. How do we stay honest? Because I didn't build this place to become an institution. I built it to be a haven, a space where vulnerability wasn't punished, where dignity wasn't bought, where leadership didn't look like power but like presence. Christopher, ever the careful steward of vision and values, created a new advisory board made up entirely of former students. Every major decision from curriculum changes to funding allocations would now be approved by the very women whose lives were shaped here. I cried when he announced it, not because I was sad to let go, but because I knew we had finally done it. We had created something that didn't need me to survive, but that would always carry me inside it. When I was a little girl, I used to believe that the house I lived in was alive. Not in the magical way children often imagine, with talking walls or hidden passageways. No, mine was alive in the way a wound pulses beneath the skin. It heard things, held things, breathed sorrow in and out like smoke. I believed it hated me. I believed it would never let me leave. But now, all these years later, I stand in front of that same house rebuilt, expanded, gleaming with glass and copper and cedar, and I see something completely different. It didn't hate me. It waited for me to come back and teach it how to love. The original cabin is still there, preserved inside the larger structure like the heart of a living body. Visitors often come and stand in quiet reverence. Some take photos, others cry. Many ask if it's really where it all began. I tell them yes. Right there, under that window, is where I washed clothes on my knees. That corner, where my mother once threw a bowl for being too slow. That wall, the one I used to stare at when I imagined running away. Every board tells a story. Every nail is part of my name. But it's what the house has become that matters more. These days, we host over 1,000 students a year, women from all backgrounds, all ages, all reasons. Some come to heal, some to grow, some to break the cycle before it reaches their daughters. And all of them leave with more than skills. They leave with their heads held higher. I often walk through the dormitories at night, not to check or supervise, but simply to be present. The halls are quiet, peaceful. From behind the doors, I hear laughter, whispered encouragement, the hum of sewing machines or fingers typing on keyboards. The future is being written in every room. One evening, I stopped by the art room, The lights were still on. Inside, a young woman named Nadia, a recent arrival from Sudan, was painting a mural. I had seen her arrive just weeks before, clutching only a bag in the hands of her two younger sisters. She spoke little English, but she painted in silence, every stroke deliberate. "What is it?" I asked, stepping beside her. She looked at me, smiled, and said simply, "It's the house." The mural showed a cabin surrounded by wildflowers. Above it, a glowing light in the shape of a woman, rising from the roof like smoke becoming sky. "It's you," she added softly, "but it's also us." I touched her shoulder gently, heart full and throat tight. There were no words big enough. That mural now covers an entire wall near the entrance to our main building. It's the first thing every girl sees when she walks through our doors. And beneath it, painted in bold white letters, is the phrase that has come to define us all. "One day, the dark basement becomes a room full of light." That quote has found its way into places I never imagined. Classroom walls, poetry collections, street art in cities I've never visited. It's been tattooed on the wrist of a woman in Boston, engraved on the bracelet of a survivor in Sao Paulo, and every time I hear it repeated, I remember the night I first whispered it to myself curled up beneath a quilt in Aunt Linda's house, wondering if anyone would ever understand what I carried. Now, the whole world seems to. In recent years, people have begun asking me more frequently about retirement. I smile politely and say, "I'll consider it when I can sit through a sunrise without thinking of 50 things that still need to be done." But the truth is I'm already letting go, piece by piece. With joy, Emily has expanded threaded light into a full foundation of its own, funding creative scholarships for women in underrepresented communities. She's designing with purpose, telling stories through fabric, and mentoring the next wave of designers who want more than beauty, they want meaning. Christopher, ever my calm strategist, is preparing the Center for Generational Leadership. He's cultivating new directors, developing programs that run themselves, digitizing our entire archive. He once told me, "This place isn't just surviving anymore, it's thriving without dependency." And I've started writing letters. Dozens of them, each one addressed to a girl who hasn't yet arrived. Some are filled with stories, others with poems, all with a message. You are not alone. I've asked the staff to keep these letters safe, sealed in a drawer by my desk, and to give one to each new student during her first week here. I want her to feel a hand reaching out through time, a whisper that says, "You belong." Because belonging, true, soul-deep belonging, was the one thing I never felt as a child. And now, it's the one thing I offer freely, every single day. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, I walk to the edge of the woods where the old creek still runs cold. The same one where I used to wash clothes until my hands were raw. I sit on a stone, listen to the water, and smile. That girl who once crouched by the bank is still here. She didn't vanish. She simply became someone who made sure no other girl would ever kneel there alone. There's a kind of silence that only comes after life has shouted everything it needed to say. It's not the silence of my childhood, the one that hung between my mother's yelling and the sting of a belt. It's not the silence that wrapped around me the night I ran through the woods with trembling hands and a bag of hidden coins. No, this silence is different. It's full, gentle, earned. I found it one morning, sitting on the porch of the house that once tried to crush me but now holds me like an old friend. The sun spilled across the boards in soft golden streaks. The garden was in bloom: lilies, sunflowers, marigolds, and for once, no one was waiting for me with a decision or a deadline. It was just me, And the light at 78, my days have grown quieter. My steps are slower, but not uncertain. My hands, once raw from scrubbing and stitching, are now soft with age, though still steady. I spend more time reading letters from former students than writing policy drafts. More time watching the birds outside the kitchen window than giving speeches. And it is enough. Every week, I still visit the center. I sit in on a class or two, not to supervise, but to witness, to feel the pulse of the place. The heartbeat hasn't changed. The laughter is still there. So is the fire. When I walk through the halls, girls still come to me, sometimes shyly, sometimes with tears. One of them, just last month, said, "Miss Antonia, did you ever think all of this would happen?" I looked around the rows of sewing machines, the whiteboards filled with notes, the photos of alumni lining the walls. "No," I said, "but I hoped. That's the truth of it. I never knew if any of this would work. I only knew what it felt like to have nothing. And I made a promise to that girl inside me, the one who once believed she didn't matter, that I would build a world where no one felt that way again." I think of her often now. When I lie in bed, I see her barefoot by the creek, eyes wide with fear and fire. I imagine telling her, "Hold on. One day, you'll walk through that same door not as a prisoner, but as a founder." And I imagine her answering, "Then I'll keep going." In the quiet, I've started working on something new, a children's book. Nothing fancy, just a small story about a girl who finds a key buried under a stone and uses it to open a door no one else sees. A door that leads to a room where her voice is never too loud and her dreams are never too big. I don't know if it will ever be published. That's not the point. I want the next generation to learn early what took me decades to understand. That survival is just the beginning. That healing is hard but possible. And that when you make something with your own two hands, whether it's a dress, a letter, a life, you are crafting proof that you belong here. Sometimes, at night, I walk through the original cabin, the very bones of the home where it all began. It's a museum now, sort of. Visitors walk slowly through it. Some ask, "Is this where you slept? Is this the stove you lit? Is this the bench you cried on?" I nod. But what they don't see is what I see. They don't see the ghost of a girl watching from the corner, wide-eyed and silent. And they don't see that she's smiling now, because she knows we made it. Legacy is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or applause. It doesn't come dressed in awards or newspaper articles. Legacy, I've come to believe, is not what people remember about you when you're gone, but what continues to grow because you dared to plant something. That thought follows me now, even in the smallest moments. When I pass by a classroom filled with laughter, when I read an email from a woman in South Africa thanking us for the online resources, when I open a letter from a girl named Olivia, who says she read my memoir under the covers with a flashlight, because her parents still believe women shouldn't speak too loud. Sometimes I reply to those letters by hand. I want them to know I'm real, that I bleed, that I failed many times before I ever succeeded. That I was never extraordinary. I was simply unwilling to let my past decide my future. Lately, I've been thinking more about what I'll leave behind. Not in the institutional sense. The center has grown into something far beyond one person. I trust Emily and Christopher completely. They have the same fire, the same vision, the same commitment to grace. The center is in strong hands. But I wonder, what do I leave behind for the ones who never knew me? Who will one day walk these halls and only know my name from a plaque or a quote on a wall? I've started recording a series of audio journals. Nothing formal, just me speaking into a recorder, telling stories. The real ones, not the versions cleaned up for interviews or documentaries, but the raw truths, the days I wanted to give up, the nights I cried in the garden, the mornings I woke up wondering if I was building something that would ever last. These recordings aren't for the world. They're for her, that girl I always carry with me, and all the girls like her. One day, when someone's world has gone quiet and cold, I hope she hears my voice and realizes someone else walked through that fire and made it out. And that means she can too. This past spring, we planted a new tree beside David's dogwood. It's a red maple tall, wide, strong. We placed a small stone at its base with a single word engraved. Continue. That's all. No name, no date, just a command, a blessing, a promise. Because that's what I want more than anything, for all of this to continue. For the classrooms to keep filling, for the girls to keep dreaming, for the threads to keep weaving into something vast and unbreakable. I want the walls of this place to remember every voice that ever echoed through them, every tear, every breakthrough, every stitched hem and trembling. I did it. One afternoon not long ago, I sat in the garden while a young volunteer was giving a tour to new students. I wasn't part of the presentation. I was just watching, listening. And this, the young woman said, is the heart of the Institute. It began with one woman, Antonia Walker. But what she built, what we now carry, isn't just her legacy. It's ours. I didn't interrupt. I didn't wave or announce myself. I just smiled and bowed my head. They no longer need to see me to know I'm here. That's legacy. It's in the girl who walks into her first class afraid and walks out ready to start a business. It's in the mother who stitches late into the night so her daughter can go to school. It's in the community gardens we've helped build, in the schools we've inspired, in every quiet decision made with courage. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know what I'll spend them doing. Continuing. I will keep writing, keep listening, keep planting, because there are still too many girls kneeling beside creeks with no one to tell them they deserve more. I will be the voice that says, yes, you do. It's strange, this feeling of nearing the edge, not with fear, but with stillness. As though I've spent my entire life running, building, reaching, and now I am simply being. Not done, just quiet. When I was younger, I feared aging. I feared irrelevance. I feared being forgotten. But what I've come to learn, what time and pain and joy have taught me, is that the things we build from love do not disappear. They echo. I see those echoes every day. In the mentorship circles that now run without my presence. In the art exhibitions hosted by women who once trembled holding a pencil. In the alumni network that spans cities, countries, continents. In the little girls who wear dresses sewn by their mothers, the very same mothers who once arrived at our door with shaking hands and tearful silence. A few weeks ago, I was honored at a statewide ceremony, something called a Pioneer of Progress award. It was held in a grand auditorium with high ceilings and velvet seats. My children were there. So were my grandchildren. Yes, I have those now, Emily's twins, Noah and Elise, and Christopher's youngest, little May, who clings to my skirt every time she visits the center like it's a blanket. She never wants to let go. When I went up to receive the award, the audience stood, not because I am famous, not because I am powerful, but because they recognized something they could feel but not name. They saw the years in my spine, the story in my hands. They saw the path that stretches from barefoot childhood to silver-haired testimony. I didn't give a long speech. I simply said, I was not born to be remembered. I was born to make remembering unnecessary. May we all build something so lasting that no one has to wonder who started it. Afterward, a reporter asked me, "What's your greatest accomplishment?" I didn't hesitate. That they no longer need me. And I meant it. To be needed is beautiful. To be no longer needed because those you raised are now raising others is the true measure of having done the work. This past month, we inaugurated a new wing of the Institute, built entirely with sustainable materials and designed by an all-female architecture firm founded by two of our former students. It houses a digital lab, an audio production studio, and a podcast room where women can share their stories with the world. They named it the Margaret Hall. I cried when they told me. They didn't know the full weight the name carried. They only knew it as a tribute to the women who came before us, those who had no chance, no voice, no rights, but whose resilience made ours possible. I walked through the doors quietly the first day. No fanfare, just my footsteps echoing against polished floors. I stood in the center of that bright, modern space, and I whispered, "Mama, they made your name mean something else." And I meant it not as an absolution, but as an offering. She was never the woman I needed, but because of her, I became the woman others did. And now, the thread stretches farther than I ever imagined. I've begun spending time in the archive room, a climate-controlled space beneath the main building, where we keep everything: letters, lesson plans, early loan applications, photos, even the original ledger where I once scribbled the names of women who came to me with nothing but hope. We've digitized it all. One of our newest interns, a brilliant coder named Sarah, created an interactive timeline. Visitors can now scroll through the decades and see the faces, read the words, hear the voices of this ever-growing sisterhood. Sometimes I go down there just to sit. It feels like visiting a sacred place, a sanctuary built not of marble, but of memory. I trace my fingers over the glass cases and smile, not out of pride, but out of awe. Not because I think I built it alone, but because I did and single quotes T. This has always been bigger than me. Always. So now, as I move through these twilight years, I carry no fear. I carry gratitude. I carry peace. The final stitch is never the end of the garment. It's the beginning of its purpose. Asterisk, if you had told that little girl by the creek, knees scraped, hands raw, dreams tucked deep in her chest, that one day her name would be etched into stone above the door of a national institute, she would have laughed. Not because she didn't believe in possibility, but because back then, survival felt like the only dream allowed. Now, all these decades later, I walk through halls that carry my name, and yet I never feel like they belong to me. Not entirely. They belong to us. Every woman who has passed through these doors, every child born from their second chances, every whisper of courage left echoing in the rafters. That is what we built, not a school, not a charity, a movement made of hands, of hearts, of thread. This morning, I stood alone inside the original cabin. The light came through the window just right, soft, golden, quiet. Dust hung in the air like tiny flecks of memory. I ran my fingers over the wooden table where I once wrote down the names of the first 7 women who showed up, uncertain and brave. They're all grandmothers now. Some have passed. Others still write me every Christmas. I lit a candle not out of sorrow, but out of reverence. There is something sacred about returning to the beginning. A few hours later, The center hosted its annual ceremony for graduates. This year, the class was the largest we've ever had, over 400 women. Some walked across the stage with babies in their arms. Some walked with canes. One walked barefoot, in quiet defiance of where she came from. I sat on stage beside Emily and Christopher, watching, listening, feeling. When it was my turn to speak, they handed me the microphone, but I didn't need it. I stepped forward, looked at the sea of faces, so many reflections of who I once was, and I said, "You are the proof, not of me, not of this place, but of yourselves. Every stitch you made, every page you wrote, every step you took out of the dark, that is the miracle. You are the light." Silence, then thunderous applause. But even louder was the feeling in the room, the knowing. Afterward, I walked slowly to the tree we planted for David, now tall and wide, its branches heavy with blossoms. Beneath it, a girl no older than 16 was sitting alone, reading a well-worn copy of my memoir. She looked up when I approached. Her eyes widened. "Are you her?" she asked. I smiled and sat beside her. "I used to be." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm her. And so are you. You're becoming her. Stronger, wiser, braver. That's the point of this place. It doesn't keep power, it passes it on." She looked down at the book in her lap. Then, softly, "Do you think I'll ever make it out, like you did?" I placed my hand over hers. "You already have. The moment you walked through those doors, you chose something bigger than fear. That's the first step. The rest, it's already in you." We sat like that for a long time, no rush, no speeches, just 2 generations and the silence between them, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that heals. Later that night, I stood at the window of my room in the original house, looking out at the campus. Lights shimmered in every building. Laughter spilled from the garden. A baby cried. Music played. Somewhere, a sewing machine still hummed. And it hit me, all at once. This is what heaven must feel like. Not clouds, not harps, just this people, becoming whole. I closed my eyes and whispered a final thought to the girl I once was. "We did it." And she whispered back, "Yes, and they will too."